Hey everybody, welcome back to New Videos channel. Happy New Year, and now we should talk about why certain things don't need imports in Vue.js, even without auto imports enabled or something like that. Let's go. When you use Vue with the composition API, especially with the script setup syntax, so as it's recommended nowadays, then you might have noticed that there are certain things that you don't have to import at all. And as said before, not even when enabling auto imports using Nuxt and so on, but in a plain Vue project. So of course in this video you want to see why is that, what's the difference, and is it good, bad? So let's dive into it, but before let's talk a little bit about Vue.js Amsterdam, which is coming up on the 12th to 14th March. It's a 3-day event together with JS World, one more day of JavaScript knowledge after 2 days of Vue.js Amsterdam with Vue-focused content. I'm looking forward to see most of you hopefully there. Would be lovely to have a chat and talk a little bit about all the changes in Nuxt, Vue, maybe also what interesting projects you've built there with Vue and Nuxt. And of course, there's a little discount code here, 10% off, including every kind of sale with my last name, Lichter. Also, link in description for that. And yeah, make sure to not miss it out. Evan, will be there in person. We have a lot of people from the Nuxt team there. And amazing people from the JavaScript ecosystem. So yeah, hope to see everyone there, and let's jump back into our demo application. And to showcase that, we can just start with the simple Vue.js playground, and it starts with the default example that's straight on play.vuejs.org here, just with a little bit of style to make sure you don't have a white flash as usual. And we all know that, okay, we have a ref here, right? We have to import it, and we use that. We have two-way data binding. That's all fine and works. Of course, interestingly, if you use something like define props in here now, well, that all works. We have TypeScript support straight away, but we don't really need to import anything here. And of course, we can define a prop here if we want to, like text, and say this is a string. We, of course, want to enable TypeScript and in case we want TypeScript notation, otherwise the compiler is correctly complaining. And now it also says, okay, hey, the prop is missing. Fine. But as you see, we don't do like an import define props from Vue, right? We don't need this. Actually, it's even discouraged. And commonly, there's an error showing when you do this in your project saying, hey, not a good idea. So once again, you might wonder now, okay, why can I import it and it works, but I also can leave it out and it works? And why is it even discouraged to not import it? Because, well, Vue doesn't have auto imports enabled by default. If you're interested in that though, another video on the topic, which I did recently, or last year, so to say. But yeah, what's the point behind it? And to dig into that, we have to go a little bit back in history. So let's take a look at the composition API, but without script setup. And to do this, we'll just remove setup here. I also remove the TypeScript just for convenience. And straight away we see, oh wait, that define props, that breaks, of course. And in general, this is not how components were written back in time, right, in Vue.js. So what was usually working is we have some export default here, and then we have something like define component. That's now the wrapper for everything around the options and composition API without the script setup. And then in here we have our big object. And of course we can define data here like we did in the options API and methods and compute and so on. But at some point, especially when the composition API came out, then we had just a setup function in here. And there we go. So we would just move the message here in our setup function, and then we return everything that's used in the template. So in this case, also the message, and everything works again as before. Is that a nicer syntax? Well, of course not. That's why we have script setup now, right? So to improve how we write things, because this will get very lengthy, especially with all the returns. And actually, Evan Yu said in one of the episodes of the Deja Vu podcast, also a link for that in the description, that releasing the composition API without script setup and the compiler magic was one of the biggest, if not the biggest mistake of the Vue 3 release. If you're curious for more, definitely check it out. But let's see how this is related to the import stuff. I think the interesting part comes in when we now switch over to the JavaScript part here, when we see, okay, this is how our component would look like after being transformed from the Vue compiler directly. And we don't have to go through everything, but this is pretty much what we have on the left side, right? And if we want to use something like props, then we'd have to pass them in here, and we could define our props here and say, okay, text might be a string, something like that, with no TypeScript way of defining them here, right? So this is just the plain old way. And when script setup came in, then a lot of things changed, of course. We didn't have to write our setup function manually anymore. Instead, what's happening, let's just do this real quick again. We put in setup here, And then let's just remove all of this. We basically just have this const message here. Wonderful. But now we still see, okay, there are some similarities because we still have a setup function here, right, on the JavaScript that's eventually compiled, right? We call some expose function. That's all what the compiler does for us, right? Then we have our const message ref hello world in here. Then a returned object is created automatically and returned. So what that setup part is basically doing is saying, okay, let's just make sure that you still have this setup function that we written manually before, but now we don't need to do it manually because the compiler can do all the magic. But then, of course, there are some issues that arise with that. Because if we now write our code as if it would be in the setup function, how do we access props? How do we access emits? And so on and so on. And the answer to that is very simple, compiler macros. So define props, for example, or also define emits. These are compiler macros. So we basically don't need to import them because they are compiled away. There are no actual functions in the Vue package. These are just hints for the compiler, of course, with TypeScript support and so on in Vue. So you can also use them nicely. That just tell the compiler, hey, please, if you use props, and let's say we define text string here, then please create them nicely. And we have that over here. Now, this structure looks a bit like what we had before with our define component approach, because it kind of is. The only difference is that the compiler is creating this for us, so we can write it in a nice and streamlined way. We don't have to worry about how to pass props in, because obviously there's not a nice way to do that here. And same as for define options, for example, to set inherit address to false, or give the component a name if you really want to, name my component. And it also all appears here eventually, because the compiler also used the define options compiler macro to insert all of that. In the same way that also works with define emits, when we have events and we say, okay, just make a simple list like close, then emits also pops up here and we're good to go. And interestingly, that's the whole point of the compiler macros. Like, they were introduced in the first place to make sure that we have the whole capability of that setup function without writing that setup function. So just to make things more streamlined. It also applies to define expose, which I might make another video on because it's pretty interesting. And also with defaults for the props, which you probably don't need anymore because the prop destructuring works now. So you can destructure props and don't have to set up defaults in that lengthy way. But there's also one more macro that came in, and that was more for developer experience. And the macro I am talking about is defineModel. Because before, when using the model, you always had to set up your model manually with passing in a prop to say, for example, model value or wherever you want to name it if you have a named model in Vue 3. And then also make sure to have an event that says add update model value, or once again, a different name. And of course, this wasn't necessarily as nice because it wasn't obvious that it was coupled, like sure, you have that name and so on, but it wasn't that straightforward and also not ergonomic to use. So with defineModel instead, well, we don't need it anymore. So if we remove these, and we see already with defineModel, we have straight away model value and also model modifiers here passed in with a merge models function that also merge these values together. So these model props with your actual props like text string. And same applies, of course, to the events. So we have update model value in here as well. And of course, we can start naming things, so we can name it differently. So it's then not model value, but in this case, I don't know, let's say dog name. Then it's dog name and dog name modifiers, and same for the update. And it's pretty ergonomic. And the best part is that here we get an actual ref. So model in this case is a model ref. And when we change that, so say model.value equals whatever, then the event will be triggered automatically. So luckily, this all works very nicely out of the box and improves the user experience a lot, plus makes code more, well, co-located by functionality. We don't have to split it up into props, emits, and actual doing things with that. No, we can just use defineModel. There are some caveats when you use reactive versus ref for the underlying structure, but that's also a topic for another video. But nevertheless, this is one of the first macros that had been introduced to improve developer experience and not only to address the let's say, functionality of the script setup syntax, right? One could argue before that, okay, a lot of things were possible by just adding another script tag besides script setup, for example, for define options. That's also kind of about the DX, but in this case, this really matters for code beyond the compile time, right? So that's a very important part here. And I don't want to miss out on defineModel anymore. But what if I tell you that there are even more macros, but just not in the core? And yes, it's true. There is Vue macro. So it's a whole library dedicated to compile time macros, to syntactic sugar, and linked to it, of course, also in the description. And it's led by Kevin Deng, who's not only part of the Vue core team, also working on Vapor right now. And it's also an amazing guy. I met him a couple of times at conferences. So we're looking into that. This is, for example, where the reactivity transform lives right now. And if you haven't heard about the reactivity transform, might be also good for another video. This was one approach to make the reactivity with ref and dot value part, let's say, nicer, but eventually was abandoned for quite some reasons. So back then we had that $ref. Instead of using count.value, we can just use it like a typical normal reactive variable. But that's, of course, for another time. Nevertheless, there are some experimental macros all in there, which can be easily used with that library and are not part of the core. And actually, a lot of things like defineModel, they were even drafted out and tested out in that library, which is in a way a pretty nice way of saying, hey, let's see what users think about certain things. And if there's positive feedback, a lot of adoption, then why not writing an RFC and moving it into the core? I think this is a pretty good approach. Also comes in terms of stability, maturity, and so on and so on. So definitely check out some macros. Some highlights here, besides the one that are already implemented by Vue for quite a while, like define options, define slots, or the, well, back then new syntax for define emits, are definitely things like define prop or define emit, where you can actually say, I want to define a single prop instead of all of them together. So you can do it line by line instead of having one big object or TypeScript object there. And same also for emits. So that can be really fun. Also certain ways to set up components, but we already talked about that in depth, for example, with Vue. So also something to take a look at if you're interested in. And there are many more things. So worth taking a look at. And also, as mentioned before, it is available for Vue libraries, but also has integrations with Nuxt, with Astro if you want to. And also, very important to make everything nicely work with TypeScript, with Volar, with the Vue official VS Code extension, and also Vue TSC. So that also means that no matter what you use, everything will just work out smoothly. There are integrations for that. So even though it's a new syntax, a new compile macros, your IDE won't go crazy and everything will work out. But that's mainly that. And now you know why there are compiler macros, why you don't need to import them, because they're just poof, gone, right? And that they're even more than the ones in the core right now. I hope that helped, and maybe the one or another already knew all these facts about it, so then that's great, thumbs up. Check out the other videos as well with some hopefully more unknown things that you can learn about it. And let me know in the comments if that was interesting, if you want to know anything else, if I should maybe make a video on reactivity transform and why this doesn't exist anymore, or maybe even other topics. So feel free to suggest things and leave some feedback down there. Besides that, I hope you started nicely into the new year, and well, time to get back to coding. So stay tuned for the next videos and content, and happy hacking.